Hey everybody, it's Captain Nabs with another SimBrief tutorial video for you. Today I've got my PMDG WestJet 737 loaded up and ready to go here so I can show you how to use a SimBrief flight plan to set up an FMC in a modern airliner. When you first use SimBrief to generate a flight plan, you're probably going to be pretty intimidated by what you see. The flight plan that's outputted by SimBrief usually ends up just looking like a wall of text and numbers to those who do not know what the various definitions of the flight plan are. Once you start to learn the elements of the flight plan, you'll actually find that it is extremely well laid out and it simply just doesn't waste a lot of time with extraneous words when simple abbreviations will do. So I'm here to help walk you through the most basics of what this flight plan contains and help you get started with your FMC. The beauty of the LIDO Flight Plan is that almost everything you need is located on the first 3 pages of the flight plan, with about 80% of what you're looking for on page 1. Here on page 1, there's 3 major sections that you're going to need to look at. The first is in the top right corner here, and this is basically a summary of the important information of your flight plan. Included here is your cost index, or CI, the distance you're going to fly over the ground distance, as well as the Great Circle distance, which is the shortest distance between the origin and destination. So you can compare the actual distance you're going to fly with the direct flight distance and see how much extra you're putting on there. You'll also see a summary of the average wind and the wind component to your flight plan. So in this case, 254 at 68 knots, and it's expected to add an average of 59 knots to our ground speed, to our airspeed the whole time. You'll also see the average deviation from the ICAO standard atmosphere, or ISA, as well as the average fuel flow expected for the whole flight. The second area you'll probably want to look at is just over here to the left of the summary, and this right here just shows you the flight planned altitude for this flight. Today, because it's a relatively short flight, flying from Toronto to Boston, we only have one altitude planned. If you're flying a heavy aircraft for a much longer flight, you may have a couple of step climbs planned in here, and they'll be shown here with the fix to start your climb at and the new altitude to climb to at every point where you have a step climb. Today we just have one altitude, flight level 370, for our altitude from Toronto to Boston. The last section we have on page 1 that's of a lot of importance to us, of course, is the fuel plan. How are we going to get there? How much fuel are we going to need to get to our destination? So you'll see here there's a whole bunch of fields. I'm going to quickly explain what they all mean. The first is the trip fuel. This is the fuel you're actually going to need from takeoff in Toronto to landing in Boston, today estimated at just over 5,700 pounds, and taking us 1 hour and 4 minutes. The second line here is the contingency fuel, 5%. This is 5% of our fuel burn to our destination that's included to allow for such contingencies as perhaps slight weather deviations, ATC, vectors, delays, speed restrictions, etc. Anything that might just cause a little bit of extra fuel burn above and beyond the bare minimum plan. Below this is the alternate fuel. So this is the airport we're going to go to if for whatever reason we can't land at Boston. So the alternate fuel measures us from having done an approach in Boston all the way over to our alternate in Providence. And today that adds up to about 1,500 pounds. And the fourth field here is the FINRES, or Final Reserve Fuel. This is the last fuel in the tanks that you're required to have. Every IFR flight has to have at least 30 minutes of fuel left in the tanks when they reach their alternate to just allow for additional delays of any kind. As you can see today, based on our current weight, we're planning to have 2,100 pounds as our final 30 minutes of fuel. When you add up these 4 fields, you'll get the absolute minimum amount of fuel we can have on board the aircraft when we take off, shown here as minimum takeoff fuel. If you add it all up, you'll come up with this answer of 9,656 pounds. Basically, 9,700 pounds is the minimum amount of fuel we can have when we start our takeoff roll in Toronto. Beyond this, we can also load extra fuel. This is above and beyond the absolute legislated minimum that you'll see calculated above, and allows us to accommodate other, perhaps slightly longer delays that we may anticipate, such as perhaps ATC holding, deviation around thunderstorms, taxi delays at our destination or our origin, anything like that, anything that the pilot and or dispatcher thinks might add to the fuel burn for the flight can be added here as additional extra fuel. As a minimum, personally, I always add at least 15 to 20 minutes of fuel just to give any kind of delays. If you're participating in any kind of major event on the online networks, such as Friday Night Ops, you may want to add an hour or more of extra fuel to allow for holding when these places get busy. Of course, when you add up your minimum takeoff fuel and the extra fuel you've planned on, you come up with your planned takeoff fuel. This is how much we expect to have when we start rolling down the runway in Toronto. If you go slightly below your takeoff fuel before you actually reach the runway, this is fine as long as you don't reach that minimum takeoff fuel value. That minimum takeoff fuel value is the least you can roll down the runway with in Toronto. Otherwise, you must go back and get more fuel. Of course, we have to add additional fuel for the fact that we have to taxi from the gate to the runway. This is usually standardized for each type of aircraft, so for the 737 here, it's considered to be 500 pounds. And thus we arrive at what is known as the block fuel or ramp fuel. This is how much fuel we want the fuel truck to put in the airplane. So bring us up to pretty much 12,000 pounds at the ramp in Toronto before we're even ready to push back and start our engines. You'll also see some other fields down here that are actually brand new and actually extremely useful. FINRES plus alternate is actually the minimum amount of fuel we need to have when we reach our destination. If we have less than this, we don't have enough fuel to get to our alternate. And this is usually used in most FMCs as the reserve fuel value. So you'll get a warning if you get to your destination and you don't have enough fuel to actually make it to your alternate. There's also a field here for trip plus taxi, and all this is just showing us how much fuel we actually expect to burn if everything goes according to plan. So even though we're going to load 12,000 pounds, if everything goes perfectly to plan, we hope to only burn 6,200 of that 12,000 pounds getting to Boston. On page 2 of the LIDO Flight Plan, the most important things you're going to find here are your routes to your destination and your alternate. Look in the middle of the page here for your routing, and look at the top here for your alternate route details. The alternate route details actually has even more than just the routing. It actually has also the distance and time and fuel burn calculated to get to your alternate. We don't necessarily need those right now, but what we do need to look at is, of course, the actual route that's been planned by SimBrief. You'll notice that for our destination and our origin, there is also a runway specified. These are based on the planned winds at your destination and your origin. So these may not necessarily work with all ATC situations, but it's a good guess on what you might use and will allow you to do some preliminary planning, especially for the arrival process. Lastly, on page 3, you'll find an estimated weight and balance situation for your flight. You'll see the number of passengers and cargo that you expect to carry, how much they weigh, which is payload, and then this is also added to our empty weight to come up with a zero fuel weight. So the weight of the aircraft without any fuel being added to it is expected to be 118,500 pounds today. Add in our 11,900 pounds of fuel, and we expect to get a takeoff weight of 129,900 pounds. This is purely an estimate based on the plan generated by SimBrief, but it can be useful for our setup process. So let's go and see the practical example. We'll hop in the airplane here. We'll pull up the FMC and we'll run through it using our SimBrief flight plan and importing the information that we need. When we first boot up the 737, the first thing the FMC is going to ask us for is to identify our aircraft to verify that we have the correct type of aircraft, a 737-700 today, and that our nav data is current. The second thing we need to do is initialize the position of the FMC if it hasn't already been done. You can tap the 6R button to pretty much always move to the next step. Position init. You can see that it actually has initialized us at a certain position. If there was no position initialized, we could use this page to set it up. And then we'll go to our route page. You can either press the route button on the FMC or press the 6R button to go to the route page. And now we can program in the route that's actually shown on page 2 of our SimBrief flight plan. Always using ICAO identifiers for our origin and our destination. And we can also specify our flight number. Today we're planned as WestJet 506. This will help show it on our progress page and other places in the FMC. On page 2, you can see that our route is blank. When we set up our route, we should always just go in order, starting with our departure process. So departing CYYZ, we'll use the planned runway, runway 23, and we'll use the planned departure. As you can see on the flight plan, it's the KEPTA 3 departure, and we're going to use the BUMPA transition today according to our flight plan. You can see everything selected here, KEPTA 3, BUMPA transition, runway 23. Perfect, everything's there. Go back to our route page, and you'll see it's there, KEPTA 3 BUMPA, and if you go back to page 1 of the route page, you'll see that the runway is now selected properly as well, runway 23. We can now type in the next fix, Avon, and put it over here on the right. If you don't put a route to get from a fix to another fix, your FMC just assumes direct. Direct from Avon then to Hank with 2 Ks. And there it is. Now after Hank we have an airway, Q935. Now because it's no longer direct, we need to specify the route here on the left side. So how are we getting from Hank to our next point? We're going to take Q935 and we're going to take it as far as the Ponset intersection. Ponct. There we go. If you made a mistake and the waypoint wasn't on your flight plan, the FMC would tell you. Or if the waypoint wasn't on your airway, the FMC would tell you. Last but not least, we have the JFund to arrival. So because it ends in a number, we know that this is actually an arrival process. So again, we hit the departure arrival button. This time we select our arrival into Boston. And you'll see we have a whole bunch of JFund 2s depending on which runway we plan to use. Do we plan to use either of the 4s? B stands for both, so 4 right or left. 15 right, 22 both, 22 right or left, 27. That's the one we're going to plan on. What you can also do is select a specific approach using one runway here, runway ILS 27, and you'll see that now all of the arrivals that don't involve 27 have been removed. So we just have the JFund 2 runway 27, our Ponset transition, and for our ILS, we're going to do the AB transition. You can review all the information here, go back to the route page, and you'll see it's all added in here now. After Ponset, we do the JFund 2 runway 27. And that's our entire route straight from our SimBrief Flight Plan, page 2. We can activate and execute it, and our route is now in our FMS. Again, 6R key will lead us to the next step, performance initialization. Most of the information we need here is located on page 1 and 3 of our SimBrief Flight Plan. Starting in the top left corner, we have our gross weight. This is how much our takeoff weight is planned to be. We can fill that in, or we can let the FMC calculate it by filling in our ZFW, which is likely to be more accurate, and our fuel. We can go to page 3 of our flight plan and get our estimated ZFW based on SimBrief's estimate of how many people are going to be on board. Or what PMGG also allows you to do, that is a really neat trick, is if your ZFW field is blank, you can click the button next to your ZFW field, and it will actually put the actual value that has been programmed into your aircraft already on the PMGG setup pages down here at the bottom. And all you need to do is paste it back on there, and you now have the correct ZFW. You'll notice that there's now an estimated takeoff weight. This takeoff weight, it looks a little bit lower than what we have planned, and the reason is because we don't actually have enough fuel on board. Right now, we only have 7,000 pounds of fuel on board, and we said we want to have 12,000. The plan field allows us to tell the FMC what we're planning to have on board whenever the fuel truck has done his job. 12,000. And now you'll notice that our gross weight has now been bumped up to what we're estimating based on the planned fuel. If you don't fill in the planned fuel, the gross weight will be the ZFW plus the actual fuel on board. But if you put in a plan, then it will actually add up the ZFW and your planned fuel to come up with your expected takeoff weight. So all of your numbers will be accurate for what we expect to have when we get to the runway. The reserves field here is our fuel reserve. This is usually given as the fuel we need to get to our alternate and the 30-minute reserve thereafter. And that's why at the bottom of page 1, we have the FINRES plus alternate fuel field. So we can put in that value, 3,663 pounds. Of course, all of these weights are always in thousands of pounds, so 3.6 for 3,600 pounds. When the FMC sees that we're going to get to our destination with less fuel than this, it will give us a warning and say we're not going to have enough fuel to get to our alternate. So that's why we have this value in here, so the FMC warns us if we're not going to have enough fuel as we're going along. Cost index, right there from the top right corner, cost index CI of 20. And if you're wondering exactly what that cost index is, I'm going to explain that in much more detail in my third video in this series when I talk about how to use the more advanced options within SimBrief. In the top right corner here, you'll see the cruise altitude is blank, and we have a maximum cruise altitude we can do on our flight based on the weights that are provided. However, you'll see that on page 1 of our flight plan here, our flight planned altitude is 37,000, or flight level 370. So we could put 37,000 or we can put 370. It'll figure out that we want to be at flight level 370. You'll notice the execute light just came on. That means that all of this has been properly initialized and we can actually commit it all to the FMS now. Again, because there's dashes here, you don't have to put in the cruise wind. Square boxes need to be completed. Dashes are optional. But since we have it here on page 1, why don't we put in that wind and get a much more realistic estimate of when we're going to get to Boston and how much fuel we're going to burn on the way. Sometimes you'll get these warnings that you may not be able to make a speed restriction at a certain fix. You can clear that, read it, understand it, but you can clear that out. Last but not least, we need to set up our N1 limit, which is our takeoff power setting and our actual takeoff speeds. We don't actually need our SimBrief flight plan for this. All of this is based on the information within our FMC, so we're going to skip those steps for now. But that's basically it. We've now set up our FMS for takeoff, except for the actual takeoff power settings, using our SimBrief flight plan. So if we only use the first 3 pages to set up our flight plan here on our FMC, what are the remaining 33 pages for? Well, they serve a couple of purposes. First of all, there's some information about how the values that you see on the first 3 pages were calculated. And secondly, you'll get weather and NOTAM information for your route on the remaining pages. So starting on page 4, you'll see a nav log. This actually lists all the waypoints in the flight plan and shows you what altitude you're expected to be at, what speed, how long it's going to take you to fly each one of these legs, how many miles long they are, and how much fuel you're going to burn on each leg. So this breaks down how all of these numbers, the time en route and the fuel, were actually calculated for you. And you can actually see a running total of expected fuel on board. So starting at our departure point, we expect to have 11,400 pounds of fuel on board. And as we go, of course, we have less and less. So we can compare how much fuel we have on board at each waypoint in our flight plan to what was planned. If we're falling way below the plan, we may have a problem. That takes 3 pages. Then we have some wind information. So these are the upper winds at various fixes at various altitudes. If we reach Hank, these are the winds at 33, 35, 37, 39, and 41,000. So we can look at them, compare them, and if we can decide if we want to go up or down, if maybe we are not getting a favorable wind at the altitude we're at. Next is the actual flight plan as it would actually go filed into the computer system. Usually we can skip right past that. And then we get to our weather. So here we'll have METARs and TAFs for our origin, our destination, and our alternate for us to review. After the weather comes the NOTAM system, pages upon pages upon pages of all the NOTAMs at, again, your origin, your destination, and your alternate. And then last but not least, LIDO does an excellent job of showing us what we're doing in terms of showing us charts. So we can actually see our route, and we can actually see significant weather along our route, upper winds along our route at various altitudes. Lots of great information here published at the end of our LIDO flight plan. And we even get a flight plan profile. So here's our departure from Toronto. Here's the actual terrain we're going to be flying over. Here are the winds at various altitudes so we can look and see how our flight compares to these various winds. And if we're not getting a favorable wind, we can maybe go up or down to try and find the most favorable wind for where we're trying to go. And there you have it. We've gone through all 36 pages. We didn't go through the NOTAMs or the weather particularly carefully, but you can go through those on your own time. But that is just the basics of how we can look through a SimBrief flight plan and program our FMC with it. So that's it for today. Stay tuned for part 3, where I'm going to go through all the options that are possible when you're flight planning in SimBrief and explain exactly what they mean, exactly how they impact your flight plan, and exactly how you can really make the most of this complicated and extremely useful website.